Marx took the ideas of classical political economy to their logical end. After Marx, one couldn't operate as a political economist without accepting the notions of exploitation and crisis that he'd so thoroughly developed. And so those who were interested in doing truly bourgeois economic theory had to abandon the notion of a labor theory of value altogether if they were to save economic theory from Marx. In so doing, thinkers like Leon Walras developed what is now called the neoclassical school of economics. Neoclassical economists abandoned the notion of value altogether. They essentially took price as a given, refusing to look behind it for any deeper meaning. In so doing, they also abandoned the whole notion of social class and all the other wider social phenomena that Marx had woven into his theory. Their restricted, narrowed perspectives soon developed an obsession with number crunching and fancy algebra. I say all of this because it was out of the neoclassical school that the critique of Marx's transformation procedure developed. And it was this new way of thinking about economics that produced the sort of assumptions that led to this critique. In 1907, Ladislav Borkovits, a Russian economist, published a paper which claimed that Marx's transformation procedure was internally contradictory, that when taken to its logical conclusion, it produced mathematical results that simply didn't add up. Ever since, people doing Marxist economics have had to contend with this accusation that their fundamental theoretical category, value, is not logically valid. Over the course of the 20th century, many Marxist economists embraced the neoclassical models of Borkovits and his successors in various attempts to rescue Marx's value theory from within the framework of bourgeois economics. It wasn't until the 1980s that some scholars began to challenge the assumptions behind this neoclassical critique and to construct a defense of Marx from within the logic of value theory. The most promising of these new defenses is the temporal single system interpretation, or TSSI for short. Let's take a closer look at Borkovitz's argument and this TSSI response. The neoclassical tradition that Borkovits came out of had several major differences from the Marxist tradition. Where Marxist theory builds a model of capitalism that is dynamic, constantly evolving, prone to disproportion and crisis, the neoclassical school views capitalism in a static, unchanging equilibrium state, where the hidden hand of the market naturally smooths out imperfections. It's important to keep this difference in mind when viewing Borkovitz's critique. It was Borkovitz's fascination with these static equilibrium models that led him to question Marx's transformation procedure. Borkovits put Marx's argument into a standard neoclassical input-output model. On the input side went machines, raw materials, and wages, all measured in their values. On the output side came newly produced commodities, all now priced at their prices of production. Borkovits then asked, quite logically, shouldn't the inputs into the production process be bought at their prices of production and not their values? Indeed, Marx himself had acknowledged that it only made sense for inputs to be bought at prices of production, but this did not lead him to the same conclusions as Borkovits. Borkovits took those end prices of production and plugged them back into the input side of his equation. When he did this, all hell broke loose with the math. Specifically, it became impossible to maintain all three of Marx's original equalities, that is, that total money profits equal total surplus value, that total money price equals total value, and total money rate of profit equals total value rate of profit. Only one equality could be maintained at a time, but only by arbitrarily imposing that condition at the expense of the other two equalities. To Marx's critics, this was the end of the labor theory of value. The TSSI critique of Borkovits is both simple and elegant. They argue that it is illogical to plug output prices back into the inputs of the same production period. They accuse Borkovits of making two false assumptions, simultaneism and physicalism. Let's look at each of these in turn. For Borkovits, the prices of inputs and outputs are simultaneously determined. In other words, input and output prices have to be equal. Let's say we have an industry that makes corn. It also needs seed corn as an input. Borkovits would argue that if at the end of the production period corn sells for $10 a bushel, then it must have also entered the production at an input of $10 a bushel. There can be no change in price. But but he seems to be arguing for some theory of time travel, as if a farmer would go back in time and sell themselves corn at their future output price. In the real world, the opposite happens. Values change over the course of a growing season, due to the productivity of labor and soil, weather, changes in technology. The price of corn at the end of the production period doesn't have to equal its price at the beginning. The new prices of production become input prices for the next production period, not the one that's already happened. In contrast to Borkowitz's simultaneous determination of prices, the TSSI is temporal. It tracks changes in the prices of production through time, from one production period to the next. In each period, the input prices are the output prices of production from the previous period. In this way, the TSSI is much more faithful to the Marxist vision, to build a dynamic model of value as it moves through time, constantly expanding. Borkowitz, in a way, defended his simultaneism by constructing his model within the framework of an economy with no growth. He argued that in an economy with no growth, prices would not change over time, and thus it would make sense to simultaneously determine input and output prices. This model of an economy with no growth actually came from Marx himself, who theorized about something called simple reproduction, an economy with no growth in which the entire social product was produced and sold in each production period. Simple reproduction was just an abstract model Marx used to simplify some arguments he was making about exchange before he introduced his more complex model of expanded reproduction. Yet, still, the theoretical possibility for simple reproduction to occur does exist, and so we do need to consider whether the transformation of values into prices of production works under conditions of zero growth. The problem is that Borkowitz assumed that no physical growth meant no growth in value. This is the essence of physicalism, that changes in value are directly tied to changes in the amount of actual physical commodities. So, if I produce twice as many cigarettes, then I have twice as much value, right? This seems to make sense. But look at the way this actually plays out in the real world. When a supply expands, its value falls. When a supply shrinks, its value rises. So, in a drought, the same amount of apples is worth more than in a glut. So just because there is more of something in physical terms doesn't mean its value is more. In fact, value can change while physical output remains the same if the production process becomes more efficient or input values change. This is precisely what happens in the TSSI version of the transformation problem. From one period to the next, the physical output stays the same. The same amount of goods are produced and consumed, but the value of those goods changes over time. Each production period, new work is done, new labor is added to the social product, and so the total value rises each production period. This total value becomes the input for the next production period. From the TSSI illustration, it becomes clear that it would be ridiculous to take the prices from the end of the production period, prices representing an increase in value, and plug them back into the equation at the beginning of that same production period. The Borkowitz solution flies in the face of the basic logic of value theory, and so it necessarily produces absurdist results. Bourgeois economics is often thought of as an objective, rational science for number-crunching specialists divorced from political bias. But all these matrices and graphs exist within a very narrow range of assumptions. By leaving out questions of value, by treating capitalism as a static, universal entity without change, and by ignoring class, it prevents itself from addressing the most essential elements of economic analysis. It is these assumptions which have led to the entire notion of a transformation problem in the first place, and to the general attack on Marxian economics. While it can be intimidating to wade into the specialist literature on a topic, we should never forget that underneath the numbers lie arguments and assumptions about the real world, and that these are, in the end, the crucial things to be concerned about. We should never be intimidated by experts into not thinking for ourselves and not challenging assumptions. In the coming economic crisis, it will be crucial to assert our ideas clearly and boldly and without bowing to the tools of bourgeois economics. It is high time to put an end to this tiresome debate about the transformation problem.